The studio lights shimmered softly on the stage as the audience waited with quiet excitement. Sandra Bullock had just finished telling a funny story about her early acting days. Laughter filled the air. The host smiled and leaned forward, his voice casual but curious. "Sandra," he said gently, "everyone knows about your long friendship with Keanu Reeves, but people have always wondered, is there something you've never told us about him? Maybe a secret?" The laughter faded. Sandra's smile froze for a moment. Her eyes blinked slowly, as if the question touched a memory she had kept buried for years. The camera focused on her face. Her fingers intertwined nervously on her lap. The atmosphere shifted from lighthearted to deeply personal. She looked down, took a breath, and whispered, "There is something." The audience leaned forward in silence. Even the host stopped smiling. The tension grew. Sandra's voice trembled slightly, not from fear but from something deeper, something that carried both gratitude and pain. "Many people think they know Keanu," she continued softly. "They see him as calm, humble, mysterious. But there's a part of him the world never saw because he never wanted anyone to know." The audience grew still. Her eyes glistened under the lights. The story that followed would change how millions viewed kindness forever. She began by describing the early years of her career, long before fame made her name familiar around the world. She was young, uncertain, and trying to find her place. During those days, she said, she would often receive small notes before important auditions. There were no names, no addresses, only small messages written in clear handwriting. "Keep shining, kid," one said. Another read, "You're stronger than you think." Sometimes there were small flowers attached, other times a lucky charm or a folded paper star. Sandra thought it was a fan, maybe someone from the crew trying to lift her spirits. She never gave it much thought. But the timing of those notes was strange. They always came when she needed them the most. One arrived after her mother's surgery when she felt lost and alone. Another came when a director told her she wasn't talented enough to lead a film. Each note carried a strange warmth that gave her strength to keep going. She looked up at the host, who was now leaning closer. The audience had forgotten to clap or cheer. Everyone was waiting. "Years passed," Sandra said, her voice steady now, "and those notes never stopped. Even after I became successful. Even after people thought I had everything. Every time life hit hard, a new message would appear." She paused again. Her eyes softened. "I never told anyone because I didn't know who was behind them. And honestly, I didn't want to know. It felt like the universe was reminding me that kindness still existed." One night, during a long shoot for a romantic film, Sandra noticed a man walking quietly across the studio lot. It was late past midnight. She was exhausted, sitting on a bench outside her trailer. The man was dressed simply, his head slightly lowered as he handed an envelope to a janitor. The janitor looked surprised and nodded gratefully. Sandra watched quietly, hidden by the shadows. When the man turned, the soft glow of a lamp revealed his face. It was Keanu Reeves. She froze. The world seemed to pause for a moment. Keanu didn't see her. He just walked away slowly, hands in his pockets, calm and quiet, as always. Later that night, Sandra went inside her trailer and found a letter on her table. It said, "Some lights shine brighter when they're shared." There was no name, but she already knew. Her voice grew softer. "That was the first time I realized he was the one behind all those years of quiet kindness." The host blinked in disbelief. The crowd murmured. A few people in the front row wiped tears from their eyes. Sandra continued, "I wanted to confront him the next day, to thank him, but he didn't let me. When I told him I knew, he smiled and said, 'Some things are better left unseen.' If it helped, that's enough." Her lips curved into a small smile. "That's Keanu. He never wants credit. He believes kindness should be invisible." She leaned back slightly and looked at the audience. "But I think it's time people knew. Not because he needs attention, but because the world needs to remember what silent kindness looks like." The host cleared his throat, visibly moved. "So you mean, all those years Keanu was quietly helping you behind the scenes?" Sandra nodded gently. "Not just me," she said. "I later found out he helped many people. Crew members, extras, even strangers. He once paid a worker's medical bill and told the studio it was an equipment cost. He sent money to an animal shelter after one of its dogs appeared in our movie. And every time he made a donation, he signed it under someone else's name. The audience gasped softly. Sandra smiled again, her eyes glistening. "You know what's funny?" she said. "For years, he made those donations using my initials. SB, he said it made him happy to give me the credit. I only found out recently by accident." Her voice cracked slightly as she whispered, "So when people praised me for being generous, I didn't know it was him." The host covered his mouth, speechless. The air in the studio was thick with emotion. Sandra took a deep breath. "I kept it a secret because I thought he would be embarrassed if people knew. But then I realized something. If we hide all the good in the world, how will others learn to do the same?" Her words touched every person watching. Even those behind the cameras looked emotional. She smiled again softly. "This isn't a love story. It's a kindness story, one that deserves to be told." She didn't know it yet, but her confession that night would start a global wave of inspiration. The audience began clapping slowly, then louder. Sandra blinked back tears. She looked off stage for a brief moment, and a faint smile appeared on her face, as if she knew who was watching. Behind the curtain, unseen by the crowd, Keanu Reeves stood quietly, his hands folded, his eyes kind. He smiled not for the applause, but for the truth, that kindness had finally found its light. The next part of the story would reveal what happened after that night, and the one secret even Sandra didn't know yet. The next morning, the world woke up to headlines filled with Sandra's interview. Every news channel replayed the clip of her trembling voice and teary eyes as she spoke about Keanu's unseen kindness. Millions of people shared it online, calling it the most touching interview of the decade. But while everyone praised Sandra's honesty, Keanu stayed silent. He didn't post anything, didn't respond to the flood of messages, and didn't appear in public. The internet was full of guesses. Some said he was embarrassed, others thought he wanted to stay humble, but no one knew the truth. Sandra, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about that night. Her words kept echoing in her mind, especially the way she had said, "If we hide all the good in the world, how will others learn to do the same?" It felt right to finally share the truth, but a small part of her wondered if she had betrayed Keanu's trust by revealing something he wanted to keep hidden. She sat alone in her home, surrounded by the quiet hum of morning light. The city outside was alive, but her thoughts were far away. On her kitchen table lay an envelope with no name, no address, just a single line written in familiar handwriting. It said, "The world needed your voice. Thank you for sharing what I never could." Her eyes filled with tears. There was no signature, but she knew who it was from. She smiled softly, whispering to herself, "You never change." Keanu. A few days later, she received a call from a producer who worked with Keanu on a charity project years ago. His voice sounded thoughtful. "Sandra," he said, "I think you should come to the foundation this weekend. There's something here you need to see." She hesitated. "What is it?" He paused for a moment. "It's better if you see it yourself." "It's about Keanu." The suspense grew inside her. She spent the next few days trying not to think about it, but curiosity pulled at her heart. On Saturday morning, she drove to the quiet part of the city, where the Silver Path Foundation building stood, a small, humble structure with no fancy boards or glass walls. As she entered, she noticed something strange. The walls were covered with framed letters, each handwritten, each from a person thanking the foundation for changing their lives. There were letters from children, single mothers, teachers, and even ex-soldiers. One said, "Thank you to the kind soul who gave us books when our school had none." Another read, "You saved my child when I couldn't afford his treatment. I will never forget your kindness." None of the letters mentioned a name, only a small mark at the bottom corner, a symbol of a paper star. Sandra's eyes widened. That same paper star had appeared in one of her anonymous gifts years ago. The producer walked up behind her quietly. "He founded this place almost 15 years ago, he said. But he made everyone promise not to use his name. He said kindness should never have a logo." Sandra turned to him slowly. "You mean this whole foundation was his idea?" He nodded. "Yes. He built it to help people who had no one. He wanted it to stay quiet, just like him. Sandra felt her chest tighten. She had known Keanu was kind, but this was beyond kindness. It was purpose. It was legacy. She walked through the hallway, reading each letter carefully. She stopped in front of one written by a woman named Lydia. The handwriting was shaky, but full of emotion. "Dear unknown helper," it said. "When my husband passed away, I didn't know how to survive with my 2 children. One night, a stranger came to our door with a box of food and a letter. He said someone had asked him to deliver it. Inside was also an envelope with enough money to pay rent for months. When I asked who sent it, the man smiled and said, 'A friend who doesn't want to be known.' Thank you for giving us hope again." Sandra wiped her eyes as she finished reading. She whispered softly, "That's him." "That's exactly who he is." The producer nodded slowly. "He always said hope should feel anonymous. It's purer that way." Then he handed her a small key. "He wanted you to have this." Sandra looked at the key, puzzled. "What's it for?" He pointed toward a small room at the end of the hall. "It's his private archive. No one's ever been inside except him." She hesitated, her heart racing. As she walked toward the door, her hands trembled slightly. She turned the key slowly and pushed it open. Inside was a simple wooden desk, a few notebooks, and photographs, hundreds of them. Pictures of families, children, shelters, hospitals, and schools. On the back of each photo, a short message was written in the same neat handwriting. She smiled again today. "They have clean water now?" He finally believes he can learn. Each note carried quiet pride, not for achievement, but for humanity. On one side of the desk lay a sealed envelope with her name written neatly, Sandra. She sat down slowly and opened it. Inside was a single letter. "Dear Sandra, you once told me that the world feels too heavy sometimes." I agreed. That's why I started leaving small lights behind, so that someone somewhere would feel a little less alone. You thought I was helping you, but it was really you who helped me. Your laughter during hard times, your strength when things fell apart, reminded me that kindness doesn't need applause. If you ever find this letter, it means the story has found its way home. Thank you for giving light to the kindness that once preferred the shadows. With respect and peace, Keanu." The paper slipped from her fingers as tears rolled down her cheeks. The letter wasn't signed with a date, but she could feel it was written long ago, perhaps years before she even spoke his name on that stage. She sat there in silence, feeling the depth of what he had built, of what he had given. She realized now that every silent gesture had been part of something much bigger, a chain of compassion stretching across countless lives. As she stood up to leave, her eyes caught a small frame on the wall near the door. It wasn't like the others. This one had a picture of her, smiling during one of their earliest movie shoots. Beneath it was a simple note. She never knew it, but she taught me how to laugh again. She pressed her hand to her heart, whispering through her tears. You changed the world quietly, Keanu, outside. The sun broke through the clouds. Sandra stood under the warm light, her eyes closed. She understood something in that moment, that true friendship isn't measured by words, but by the silent ways it helps us become better people. She walked away from the building with a calm smile, holding the letter close to her heart. But what she didn't know yet was that Keanu had one more secret, one that would connect their lives in a way she could never have imagined. The soft evening light poured through Sandra's window as she sat by her desk, still holding the letter Keanu had written years ago. She had read it over and over again until every word felt carved into her heart. The calm tone of his handwriting, the quiet wisdom in his words, everything reminded her that his kindness had always come without noise, without pride. But that night, something felt different. As she looked out the window, the city lights shimmered like stars, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover. She thought about the final line in his letter. If you ever find this letter, it means the story has found its way home. What did he mean by the story has found its way home? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone ringing. It was an unknown number. When she answered, a gentle female voice spoke. "Miss Bullock," the caller said softly. "This is Anna from the Silver Path Foundation. I work with the volunteers Keanu trained years ago. We recently found something while restoring one of the shelters he funded. I believe it belongs to you." Sandra frowned slightly. "Belongs to me? Are you sure?" The woman's voice grew even gentler. "Yes, it was sealed in a metal box with your name on it. Would you like to come see it yourself?" Her curiosity stirred again, mixed with a sense of nervousness. "Yes," she said quickly. "Please tell me the address." That night, she could barely sleep. Her mind kept wandering through old memories, film sets, shared laughs, long quiet drives between takes, and the way Keanu always listened more than he spoke. She remembered how he always carried a small notebook with him, scribbling quietly whenever no one was watching. When she once asked what he was writing, he had smiled and said, "Just reminders of what really matters." The next morning, Sandra arrived at the old shelter on the outskirts of the city. It was a small, worn-down building surrounded by tall trees and open skies. Despite its age, there was peace in its simplicity. A group of children played near the entrance, laughing and chasing each other, their happiness filling the air. Anna, the volunteer, greeted her warmly and led her inside. The smell of freshly painted walls mixed with the scent of old wood. On one side of the main hall, there was a corner filled with drawings and photographs, gifts from children and families who had once lived there. Anna led Sandra to a small room at the back. On a simple wooden table sat a rusted metal box with a tag that read, "For Sandra, when the world is ready." The words sent a chill down her spine. She touched the box gently before opening it. Inside were several small items wrapped in brown paper. She carefully unwrapped the first one. It was an old photograph of her and Keanu on set, both laughing in the rain during a break in filming. She remembered that day clearly. It had been storming so heavily that shooting had stopped. But instead of hiding, Keanu had run into the rain, saying, "It's just water, not the end of the world." The second item was a small, worn-out notebook with a leather cover. She opened it slowly. Inside were handwritten notes in Keanu's familiar writing. Lists of names, drawings of places, and short sentences that read like quiet promises. Build a school near the old bridge. Help the girl with the violin dream. Donate books under her name. She flipped through the pages, realizing that most of these promises had already been fulfilled. Each note matched something she had seen earlier in the Foundation's records. The same names, the same stories. Then, near the back of the notebook, she found a small folded piece of paper with her name written in the corner. She unfolded it slowly and began to read. "Dear Sandra, you once told me that hope feels like a fragile thing. You said sometimes you worry that people forget how to be kind. I never forgot that conversation. It became my reason to start something that would keep kindness alive, even when we're gone. I made a promise, not just to myself, but to you. I promised that the world would remember kindness through every small act we leave behind. Every child who studies, every family that eats, every dream that grows, they are all part of that promise. And if you're reading this, it means you kept your part of it too, by believing that people still care. Thank you for giving light to something I could never have spoken aloud. One day, this foundation will belong to you. It was always meant to. Not because of fame or money, but because you carry the same heart that built it. Your friend always, Keanu." Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers trembled as she reread the letter. The thought that he had planned all of this years ago without ever telling her filled her chest with an overwhelming mix of sorrow and gratitude. Anna spoke softly behind her. "He left the foundation under your name, Miss Bullock. We've just finished the legal process. He wanted you to decide its future." Sandra turned slowly, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Me? But why?" "Because," Anna said with a small smile, "you inspired it. He used to tell us that the foundation existed because someone once reminded him that kindness matters more than success. I think he was talking about you." Sandra sat down, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. All those years of friendship, all those quiet moments when she thought he was simply being polite. They now felt like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. She thought about how he never sought attention, never asked for gratitude. His kindness had never been about recognition. It had always been about continuation. She looked around the small room. The children's laughter from outside drifted in through the window. She whispered softly, "You wanted this to live beyond you, didn't you, Keanu?" For a moment, she could almost hear his voice in her memory, calm, sincere, and filled with warmth, saying, "Kindness is only real when it keeps moving." As she wiped her tears, Sandra smiled gently. She realized that this was more than a gift. It was a mission, a promise passed from one friend to another. She closed the notebook carefully and placed her hand over it, feeling its weight, not of paper, but of purpose. That night, when she returned home, she placed the notebook on her bedside table. She couldn't sleep, so she sat by the window again, staring at the city lights. For the first time, she felt completely still, not lost or confused, but at peace. She whispered into the quiet night, "You kept your promise, and now I'll keep mine." But just as she spoke those words, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It contained only one line, the same line that started it all years ago. "Keep shining, kid." Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, staring at the screen. Was it him? Was it someone from the Foundation continuing his tradition? Or had Keanu planned even this moment years ago? The mystery deepened, pulling her back into the story he had written long before she ever realized she was part of it. The night sky outside Sandra's window shimmered with quiet stars as she stared at her phone. The message glowed softly on the screen. "Keep shining, kid." It was the same phrase that had once appeared in all those mysterious notes. The same words that had carried her through some of the hardest moments of her life. Her heart beat faster. It felt impossible. Keanu's handwriting, his words, his timing, but he hadn't sent her a message in years. She whispered to herself, "It can't be him, can it?" For a long time, she sat frozen, the phone still in her hand. Finally, she typed back one word. "Who?" There was no reply. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Silence. She placed the phone down gently and tried to calm her thoughts. Maybe it was someone from the Foundation. Maybe Anna or one of the volunteers had sent it as a tribute. Yet something deep inside told her it was more than that. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her mind kept returning to Keanu's letter. "One day, this foundation will belong to you." His words had a sense of completion, almost as if he had planned every step. But how could he have known she would find all of this now, at this exact time? The next morning, she woke up to another surprise. A small package lay on her doorstep, wrapped in simple brown paper. There was no address, no note, only her name written in neat handwriting. Her heart skipped as she carried it inside and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small wooden music box. It looked old, carved by hand, with a single engraved word on top. Always. She turned the small metal key and opened it. A gentle melody began to play, slow and soothing. She recognized it instantly. It was the same tune Keanu had once played on the piano during one of their film breaks years ago. He had told her then, "Music is how I remind myself that silence can still be beautiful." As the melody played, she noticed a small folded paper hidden inside the box. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Dear Sandra, if you found this, it means you're following the trail. Don't stop now. There's one last place you need to visit, the old treehouse near Silver Creek. We built it once for a reason you didn't know then. Now it's time you did." "Your quiet friend," Sandra covered her mouth in shock. The old treehouse. It was something from decades ago. During the filming of one of their first movies together, they had visited a small countryside town for a location shoot. In the free time between scenes, the cast and crew had helped rebuild a broken children's treehouse in the nearby woods. Keanu had stayed late every night to fix the steps, saying that every child deserved a safe place to dream. At the time, it had just felt like another one of his kind gestures. But now, it suddenly meant something more. She packed her bag, called her driver, and made the trip to Silver Creek. The road twisted through quiet hills and golden fields. Memories flooded back with every turn. The laughter, the smell of sawdust, Keanu hammering nails while humming softly. and his words echoing in her mind. Every hand that builds something kind leaves a mark, even if no one sees it. When she arrived, the sun was setting behind the trees. The air smelled of pine and soil. The treehouse still stood, a little older but strong. Its wood had darkened with time, and vines wrapped gently around its base. She climbed the narrow steps carefully. Her heart raced with every movement. When she reached the small wooden door, she noticed a single golden key hanging from a nail beside it. Attached to the key was a note, "One last light." Her fingers trembled as she unlocked the door. Inside, sunlight filtered through cracks in the wood, scattering golden rays across the floor. Everything was just as she remembered. The little wooden benches, the window facing the creek, the initials carved into one corner, K+S, a memory of their friendship, carved by Keanu himself. But now there was something new. In the center of the room stood a small chest covered with dust. She knelt down, wiped it clean, and opened it slowly. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each labeled with a name and a date. Some were old, others recent. Each one contained letters of encouragement, hope, and love, all written by Keanu. But at the very bottom of the box lay one envelope different from the rest. It had her name written in the middle, "For Sandra when she finds her way back." She opened it with shaking hands. "Dear Sandra, I knew you'd find this place again. I left it here because I wanted you to remember what we built together. Not the movies, not the fame, but the quiet things, the ones that last. You see, I never told you the real reason I started the Silver Path Foundation. It wasn't only about helping people. It was about keeping a promise. One I made to someone you once helped without even realizing it. Years ago, during one of our earliest films, you stayed late one night to comfort a child who had wandered onto the set. His name was Liam. His mother was a worker, struggling to keep her job. You gave her your own jacket and told the little boy that people still care. That moment changed both of their lives. Later, when I met them again, they were part of a shelter program. I promised them I'd continue your kindness for as long as I could. The foundation, the schools, the donations, they all started because of that one moment you probably forgot. You didn't know it, but your kindness started everything. You were the first light. If people ever remember me, I hope it's only as a reflection of that light. Thank you for showing me how to see goodness when I had forgotten how. With all respect and gratitude, Keanu." Tears streamed down her face as she held the letter close. She remembered the night he mentioned, the little boy crying by the catering tent, the frightened mother, and how she had simply given her jacket and a few kind words. She had forgotten that moment completely, but Keanu hadn't. She sank onto the floor, overwhelmed by emotion. The treehouse felt alive, filled with echoes of laughter and the whisper of old memories. She whispered softly through her tears, "You turned my small act into a movement of hope." As the last rays of the sun slipped through the cracks, she noticed something written on the wall near the window. Faint, carved letters she had never seen before. They read, "Kindness starts small, but it never ends." She smiled through her tears. That was Keanu, simple, humble, and endlessly kind. As she left the treehouse, the sky turned golden and quiet. She walked back toward her car, her heart heavy yet full. She looked up at the glowing horizon and whispered, "You kept your promise again." But as she reached the car, her phone buzzed once more. It was another message from the same unknown number. This time it said, "The boy wants to meet you." Her eyes widened. She whispered, "Liam?" The suspense grew again. She knew this story wasn't over. The final truth was waiting for her somewhere beyond the next sunrise. The next morning, Sandra sat quietly in her car, the message still glowing on her phone. "The boy wants to meet you." Her heart pounded with both fear and curiosity. It had been decades since that night on the movie set, the night she comforted a crying child named Liam. Could it really be him after all these years? She followed the address that came through a few minutes later. It led her to a small art school in the suburbs, surrounded by blooming gardens and laughter. On the entrance gate hung a wooden sign that read, "The Liam Foundation for Creative Hearts." As she walked inside, she heard soft music and children's voices. An art exhibition was taking place. Colorful drawings filled the walls, all themed around kindness and hope. At the center of the hall stood a young man in his late 20s, calm, confident, and smiling. When he turned, she froze. His eyes had the same warmth she remembered from that frightened boy years ago. "Miss Bullock," he said softly, "I was hoping you'd come." She blinked back tears. "You're Liam?" He nodded. "Yes. I've been waiting a long time to thank you." They sat down together as the sunlight streamed through the windows. Liam told her everything, how her small act of kindness that night had changed his life. After his mother passed away, years later, Keanu had found him and promised to support his education. He never spoke much about it, but he always said, "This is a gift that started with someone else's kindness?" Liam smiled, his eyes glistening. "He told me you were the reason he began the foundation. He said you showed him that kindness is the only thing that grows when you give it away." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "He never told me that. I didn't even remember that night until I read his letter." Liam nodded. "He didn't want you to. He said true kindness shouldn't make people feel like they owe you anything. He just wanted you to know when the time was right." Then he handed her a small envelope. "He left this with me. Said to give it to you when you were ready." She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a small card with 2 sentences in Keanu's handwriting. "Our lives are the brush. Kindness is the color. Paint the world bright." Sandra smiled through her tears. She looked around the room filled with laughter, paintings, and children full of dreams. The air itself felt alive with everything Keanu had built. Not for fame, not for applause, but for love. She turned to Liam and whispered, "We'll keep it alive. Together." Liam smiled. That's all he ever wanted. As she walked out of the art school, the evening sun bathed the world in gold. She looked up and smiled softly, knowing Keanu's kindness hadn't ended. It was still growing in every life it touched. Weeks passed, but the moments from the art school stayed alive in Sandra's mind. She often found herself replaying Liam's words. "He said you were the reason he began the foundation." Every time she thought of Keanu, she felt a mix of pride and longing. He had built something larger than himself, yet had hidden behind silence so that others could shine. One evening, she sat alone in her living room surrounded by the letters, photos and keepsakes she had collected from his journey. Each one told a story of kindness, a school rebuilt, a hospital funded, a child saved, a stranger given hope. And now, all of it rested in her hands. She realized it wasn't just a legacy, it was a responsibility. The next morning, she made a decision. She called Anna from the Silver Path Foundation and said softly, "It's time we open the doors again, not just as a charity, but as a movement." A few weeks later, under a bright morning sky, the foundation held its first global gathering. People from all walks of life filled the hall. Teachers, students, doctors, artists, and families whose lives had been touched by Keanu's quiet generosity. There were no banners with his face, no speeches of glory, only simple photos showing small acts of kindness. Sandra walked to the stage slowly. She wore a simple white dress, her expression calm and full of gratitude. The crowd quieted as she began to speak. "Years ago," she said softly, "I thought fame and success were the brightest lights, but I was wrong. The brightest light comes from kindness, the kind that doesn't need cameras, applause, or credit." She paused, her eyes glistening. The world knew Keanu Reeves as an actor, but I was lucky enough to know him as a friend. He once told me that real kindness must be invisible, but today I think he'd be proud to see that invisible kindness finally visible. Not for him, but for all of us. The audience sat in deep silence, listening to every word. Sandra continued. He believed every small act of care could grow into something much bigger. And he was right. This foundation, these people, this love, all of it started with one simple act, one small moment that neither of us thought would matter. She looked around the hall and smiled gently. He taught me that the most powerful stories aren't written on paper. They're written in people. And this story isn't just his or mine. It belongs to everyone who still believes in kindness. As she finished, the lights dimmed slightly. A video began to play behind her, Short clips of Keanu's work around the world, his laughter with children, his quiet smiles at hospitals, his hands building, teaching, helping. The crowd rose to their feet, some clapping, others wiping their eyes, and then, at the end of the video, Keanu's voice played softly, recorded from years ago. We can't all change the world, but we can change someone's world. That's enough? The room filled with emotion. Sandra closed her eyes, tears rolling down her cheeks. She whispered under her breath, "You're still here, aren't you?" After the event, she walked outside to the garden behind the building. A small memorial stood there, a simple stone engraved with the words, "Kindness starts small, but it never ends." Beside it, she placed the little music box he had sent her. When she turned the key, the gentle melody filled the air again. Children gathered around, curious. One little girl asked softly, "Who made this song?" Sandra smiled. "A man who believed that kindness is music for the heart." The girl nodded thoughtfully. "Then it should never stop playing." Sandra looked at her, eyes warm, and said, "It won't." As the melody continued, she felt a quiet peace within her. Not the emptiness of loss, but the calm of understanding. She finally knew what Keanu had meant in his last note. Our lives are the brush. Kindness is the color. She looked toward the sky, the sunlight glowing through the trees, and whispered, "You painted it beautifully." My friend. Months later, Sandra launched a new project called The Unseen Lights. It encouraged people around the world to perform acts of kindness anonymously, to feed someone, teach someone, comfort someone, and then pass it on. Within weeks, stories began to appear online from every corner of the world. Strangers helping strangers, children planting trees, families supporting one another. In every story, people ended their messages with one simple phrase, "Keep shining, kid." And just like that, the kindness that began decades ago kept spreading, silent yet unstoppable. As Sandra stood by the foundation's window one evening, she smiled as she watched the lights of the city flicker like stars. She whispered softly, "You were right, Keanu. The story found its way home." And in that quiet moment, her phone buzzed once again. A new message appeared from the same unknown number. It said only 2 words, "Thank you." Her eyes filled with tears, and a soft smile curved on her lips. She looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," she said gently, "thank you." The screen dimmed. The melody of the music box played faintly in the background, and the story of 2 souls bound by quiet kindness came to a peaceful close. A reminder to the world that love doesn't need to be spoken to be heard.